of some of these types of traumatic events. And so understanding, for example, chronic and complex trauma in that, in terms of what kids experience, might hopefully give teachers an understanding that these students oftentimes are in chaotic environments that make it harder to learn. And so my 2 cents would be just, to adopt a framework similar to the NTCSN, where when we talk about trauma, it's not just this broad amorphous notion, but that there's a way to understand and to make it clear that this is just our way of categorizing them, but that for students, it may be a little bit more complicated than that.
Let me go sort of a step beyond that, but because I agree. And I think one of the things that those of us who sort of work in this area really tend to think about all of these nuances for trauma. And yes, there are certainly differences in what you may expect from a child who's exposed to something chronically versus acutely. But if you think about the way the body responds and the types of behaviors you're going to see, you take all these different types of trauma, and 70%, 80%, 90% of what you see, it's going to come through the final common pathway, and it's going to look pretty darn similar. And if you think about how to help and support these children, in terms of both what the teachers need to know to kind of consider things through a trauma lens, and what clinicians need to know in terms of the types of interventions that are effective, there too, we know that while there are differences on the margin, 80% of what you want to do to support those kids is similar. And so while I do think it's important for us, and particularly those of us who specialize in this, to make those more nuanced definitions so we can help in that extra 20%, 10%. For many educators, I'm not sure we're doing a disservice by making all of these nuances. Rather, I think there's a core set of understanding and belief and skills that we need to be able to communicate and to be able to support our educators in helping these students, which is good because, they got lots and lots of other things on their plate. So if we needed to have one type of intervention and approach for sexual abuse and one for physical abuse and one for community violence and one for kind of a natural disaster, or SOL, there's no way we're going to be able to help educators do all that. But that's not the reality. If there's a core here, folks, and if we can help to communicate that core, I think that's going to be better in helping our students than where 95% of our schools are today.
Sorry, could I add to that? I really like that point that Brad made, and to add to that, I think really understanding whatever that core is for us, right? And I did a presentation yesterday in self-regulation. So one example might be really understanding some of these key mechanisms that interact and interfere with the learning processes for children. And so understanding, for example, how self-regulatory processes have been impacted by different types of traumatic events. We can then understand, for example, how and what are some of these core program components that might help boost or bolster self-regulatory capacities for kids. And I think in terms of the research and the evidence, as researchers, we need to further study some of these key mechanisms that actually explain, especially for those who've experienced trauma and maltreatment, how these are impacted and how those actually directly relate to achievement and performance in the school setting, because that might provide sort of this overview of how we can then help in some ways, regardless of the traumatic event, chronic or acute, that we understand that these mechanisms are universal for kids.
Great, thank you. So I want to shift to something that I think Susan really brought to light, and a couple of questions related to how can schools provide services and help youth at need without stigmatizing them or constructing differences? A number of questions around as we become aware of trauma that students bring to the educational setting, how do we protect their confidentiality? So I'm wondering if maybe you want to start that one.
I guess I have a lot of thoughts on this. One thing I would just kind of throw to my other panelists, when I hear the language of trauma-informed schools, I'm like, I wish all schools were trauma-informed. Um, uh, just given that, and I understand the reason why we're placing attention on trauma, but I think in some ways some of this really starts with the underlying safety and orderliness and general love and appreciation for students in a school community. And I think attention to that at the climate level, that this is a place where we value all students, is a really important starting point. So climate first, relationships first. I think number two, and we can quibble about the evidence base, but really there's this issue where you really want to try to really join relationships and rigor, that even though students might come in with learning differences, that we really have beliefs and expectations for the highest capacities of students, regardless of where they come in. Third, my sense of things, and the last two pieces are more anecdotal. We've shown you the beautiful triangle where services are really well distributed across the tiers, and that's the ideal. In practice, I typically see schools where they're really great at tier 3, or they're really great at tier 1, but then there's not a full comprehensive area of, or cascade of supports. And I think we also finally need to really think about how help seeking is framed. Unfortunately, in a lot of the schools I see, seeking help is seen as weakness versus seeking help is a good thing. And so I think this comes in with kind of a second chances attitude that, as Ron Ferguson, the educator, says, like, this school is committed, this school is committed to perfection at some basic level. And I think those are kind of the attitudes that dampen stigma.
Sure. So, for a lot of the programs and schools we've worked with, we certainly see framing of this issue. And I think where you see most people now really talking about it is helping students deal with stress. Because there are very few students out there who, in one way or another, aren't dealing with some type of stress. And if you look at the foundation of a lot of the Tier 2 and Tier 3 programs, while they're designed to help students who may have anxiety or PTSD or depression, a lot of the skills they're learning in those programs in terms of sort of emotional regulation and self-care and relaxation are really relevant to students more broadly. And in terms of teachers, in being able to act empathically with a student, yes, if a student's been exposed to a traumatic event and you come across them and they're crying or they're frightened, and if a teacher says, well, this is a real problem, are you going to be able to study for your test tomorrow? That's probably not the most empathic type of response that you want. But the types of skills that you would teach teachers in being able to work with those students, in listening to them, are exactly the same types of skills that you would want teachers to be able to learn and model if they run across a student who didn't do their homework or perform poorly in terms of a test in their grade. So, I don't think, oftentimes these things we're talking about are something that's like, well, we're going to put it separately over here, or we're going to consider it a very special program. And I think one of the things that you've heard all of us sort of allude to is really thinking through how can you help schools think about this as a part and parcel of everything they do all day in interacting with kids, because you know something? The majority of these things are going to be beneficial to some students at some point. And so I think this idea of framing it as helping students be more supportive and empathic, helping teachers be more supportive and empathic, helping students be more resilient in the face of stress, are really some of those types of framing that is legitimate but helps to move us away from some of the stigmatization that often accompanies children who have mental health disorders.
I wonder too if it's in some way we can help, more self-reflective practices, not just for the students but also for the teachers to understand, severity and a continuum across the severity of some of the problems in what they're experiencing, like stress. So rather than on or off, that things are severely problematic and you have to go to tier 3 right away, or it's not there. So I think tier 1 should be okay. Having a better understanding, for example, if we scale the level or the type or the intensity of what I'm experiencing for stress, for example, can a student understand that, hey, today I'm feeling stress at a level 1, and then tomorrow they may experience 10, maybe the next day they experience 5. Can they track and be more self-aware of the rise and fall of their stress level so that they know at which point that they should actually seek help, and that in some way, if you think about prevention and intervention programs out there, we have to consider dosage effects. And so is there a way to sort of bring that down to the individual level for the student as well as the teacher, that the severity and the dosage of the quote-unquote intervention, whether that's an empathic responding to the student, has to match the level of intensity that the student is at. So you're not, if the student is crying and they're able to verbalize that the stress level that they're at is at a 10, this teacher coming in saying, you can't ... their response might be somewhat more appropriate for a student at a stress level intensity of a 1 versus someone that's already at a 10. So being able to, it's a dynamic process, right? So teachers need those skills, and students need those skills of self-awareness that they will be able to then hopefully at some point communicate with each other. Understandably so, if a student is at a 10, they probably won't be able to communicate that. And so a teacher will need to be able to recognize that and say, okay, I need to bring my response to a different level. Or if I can't do that, can I access tier 2 services that could help me with this student who may be consistently at that level, but not necessarily rising to the level of crisis mode.
Thank you. There are a number of questions about universal screening at Tier 1 and whether there are reliable trauma screeners that might be incorporated into a multi-tiered system. And so thoughts about whether that's happening, if it's being used, and what you think about the utility.
I was afraid that was coming down here. All right, so what do we know? We know that if you don't screen, that there are kids that are going to be suffering silently in the back of the classroom that you miss, okay? So we know screening helps us to identify those kids. However, we also know that before you screen, you darn well better think about what you're going to do for those kids that you identify. Because it is, I would actually suggest it is inappropriate and unethical to screen and identify a child and not have thought through what you're going to be able to do to support that child. Okay? So I think that is sort of my answer philosophically to screening. If the school and the system and the community has thought about, if we identify these kids, what we're going to do, fine. I'm wholeheartedly in favor of screening because it's clear. It's very clear we identify kids that otherwise we otherwise don't find. But it does make me nervous. If you go to our websites, there are certainly there are a couple different screens. Screens need to be short. They don't need to be perfect. If a screen's going to take someone 5 minutes to go through it and kind of score it, it's too long. So we've tended to come up with something pretty brief that kind of can identify different types of traumatic event exposure and enough symptoms that we think the kid qualifies, and then they talk to someone before entering kind of a tier 2 or tier 3 intervention. Most schools have adopted that, and it seems to work fairly well. Different schools have adopted different things. Again, you can find that on the CBITS website and on the SET website. You can find some of those screens. That said, a couple things related to that. One is we know for some of those targeted interventions, we'll have kids that everyone's like, well, we know this kid has a problem, and they're not endorsing symptoms on a screener. We've sort of learned that if a kid either isn't symptomatic or isn't ready to deal with it, they may not be appropriate for that intervention at that time. And so you hear me talk about timing and sort of the structure. The other thing that I think in our experience in helping schools to sort of implement this is, while we are wholeheartedly in favor of screening, screening also takes resources. In many cases, what we do is we work with schools to kind of have teachers nominate and identify kids, because teachers are going to know who these kids are. I mean, teachers are going to know. They may not know them all. They're going to know a bunch of them. And in the first year they do it, have sort of teacher nomination to be able to build a group or two so the school gets some experience. And then in year 2 and year 3 kind of go to the screening when they've got a little bit of experience under their belt and running the groups. So I do think there are a variety of things out there, but I wanted to make that point because screening comes up all the time. Yes, I think it should be done. At the same time, I think we need to be very thoughtful.
So if you remember the multi-tiered model that we presented for the Solanco partnership, Tier 1 does include a screening measure, and at this point we haven't really identified a screener yet, because I agree with Brad that you want to make sure that before you put that screener in place that you have the supports necessary to help those that will be identified. Otherwise it is definitely unethical. And so what we're doing is making sure that we get an understanding of what the school district needs, what each school in the school district would need, and we would refer back to our logic model to see what it is that our program is targeting as far as the mechanism of change, and what we expect to see change and happen, and make sure that we have safeguards in place at each tier, especially at the tier 3, so that if those do come up and rise to that level, that we have care coordination in place. And so the screener that we would select will depend upon the targets that we would have and what supports would be in place. That said, the school district as a whole have actually done a good job with some of these identification, and so we would work together with the school to see what's more appropriate within the school district and what they want to see change within their student body. So that's where we are as far as the selection of a measure or a screener.
So another question that has come up is, hold on, I lost my place. How is it that with these interventions that are really helpful for children that are experiencing trauma, what is the best way for children to actually access the intervention without losing a lot of instructional time, and what are the effects of them being, how do they fit that in? If they're using their kind of free time or other time at play to access those interventions, what is the impact of that?
If you have this, I think that's kind of an on-school basis, but I would remind us of the general principle of, do you have spaces to do this where it de-amplifies stigma? So I think schools I've seen that really get it have kind of universalized spaces for advisory and other forms of help, and so kids can be all at the same time doing different kinds of supports together. So that's a really general sense, but I'm sure that CBITS has thought about this as well.
We've thought about it, and we've learned from lots of mistakes, which is probably the way I've learned best. So I will tell you that when we first did CBITS, this came up. And it's like, okay, we've got this figured out. We're going to do it after school, right? So we don't get in the way of instructional time. And there are lots of problems with this. The problem that we got bit by is parents are like, my kid's not staying there after school. The only way he's safe walking home is walking with his friends. Right? It's completely unsafe. I do think it's individual school. I think things are going to work differently at different schools. Again, here's one where I think there's sort of a learning process. That this was, oh my Lord, everyone was terrified. You're going to take this child out. CBITS is like 8-10 sessions, okay? And everyone was terrified. You're going to remove this kid educationally, and it's going to kind of cause all sorts of problems. Academically, which is the school's focus. And then by the end of the first group, that the teachers like, because we interviewed the teachers, and it's like, well, this was a concern, what are you saying? He's listening to me more, he's concentrating more. And we've got data that their grades and attendance gets better. We go back into that school the next year, teacher's like, oh, please, use my class time, please. I want kids to get in there right away. So I think it is a concern. I think it needs to be thoughtfully done in school. I think it needs to be done in a way that is sort of non-stigmatizing. And I think this varies school to school. We have found, and I think most places have found, that once a school gets some experience with it, they're able to find things during the day, including occasionally pulling a child out of an instructional class, because the benefit of this is so high. And you know, the other thing I think, again, because we're hearing a lot about stigma, and I think it's very, very important not to label it. But remember, for CBITS, for a lot of these things, these are skills. And so, you know, we have, and we talk about confidentiality with the kids, that you're in a group and you can't share. And the kids are pretty good at that. But then what we hear from lots of schools over the years now is the kids will be out in the playground, and they won't talk about what they're talking about in a group, but they'll say, you know, in my stress group, I learned when I get stressed, I can do X, Y, and Z. You got really you got really upset during the kickball game. Maybe you should try some of these things. And we will have fifth graders trying to teach their fourth grade buddies some of the skills they're learning in groups. So yes, we want to be careful and be aware of stigma. At the same time, for many of these kids, skills about handling stress and dealing with traumatic events, these are as much life skills as the reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Okay, thank you. I think we're going to take one more question. Jenny Knoll. And then we'll take a break for lunch.
Okay, just one question to end this session. I'm really confused. And I'm kind of looking around, I'm trying to read the audience here a little bit, and I just wonder if we can kind of wrap this up a little bit before we turn to bigger policy issues. But I'm confused because I hear Carlo and Brad talking about a new program, or a program they're creating in Solenco, and they're bringing together lots of different things. Like they're trying to find a screening tool, they're trying to figure out which is the best interventions, they're trying to bring communities together. And then I hear Dr. Stein talking about all these great resources and things that have already been vetted, and on the website all of these wonderful systems and models in place. So as a bunch of educators sitting around trying to decide whether we're ready to kind of take this step or jump off, I mean, I don't think we need to start from scratch. It seems like there's a lot that's there already. So I'm wondering if we can reconcile kind of these two, which seem to me kind of disparate presentations between, thank God for Solenco County and their willingness and really capitalizing on what's been done already to facilitate this transfer of knowledge and the implementation that, and some of the wicked problems that Dr. Stone talked about. Can you guys just take a little bit of time to reconcile some of these things for us?
Sure. What I want to be clear about is, the partnership and the collaboration with Solanco for us is really understanding the community that we will be working